Now consider this idea of God's Son being divine contains two key components. One of them is that God has a Son. The other one is that that Son is a divine being, that He is deity. And so to look further into this subject, we need to consider that God has a Son and that He is divine. Some believe that the idea of God having a Son is totally foreign to Old Testament teaching. There are well-known world religions that thoroughly deny the idea that Jesus could be the Son of God. He encountered that himself in his ministry. You can read in the Gospels where people vigorously objected to the idea that he could be the Son of God because in their minds that made him equal with God. And they just thought that couldn't be. And some who protest the notion of Jesus being the Son of God would say that's exclusively a New Testament idea. That Christianity borrowed those kinds of ideas from pagan religions of the day, and that has nothing to do with what the Old Testament taught. Well, I'm going to show you that it had everything to do with what the Old Testament taught. We won't look into the full panorama of Old Testament teaching about God having a Son, but we will examine some of it. Consider, for example, Psalms chapter 2, a song that is universally regarded as being a messianic psalm, or a psalm that is talking about the Messiah. He said in verse 7, I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Now the subject of this song in Psalms chapter 2 says that the Lord has said to me that I'm His son. So this passage talks in very positive language about God having a son. Now in the context, the passage talks about the rulers of the world and the rulers of the people of Israel rising up against God's Son. It talks about things being done against God's Son. You'll find some of these things quoted in the New Testament in passages that talk about His crucifixion. It is a prophecy of the crucifixion of Christ and of the establishment of His kingdom. So understand that the context deals with the idea of people rejecting God's Son. And I want you to notice the last verse of this chapter, verse 12. With regard to the fact that some would reject the Son of God, He said, kiss the Son, lest He be angry, and you perish in the way when His wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in Him. Now in this context, the idea of kissing the Son is a symbol of worship and adoration. It's more than just an affectionate kiss, but it's a show of loyalty. And He promised a blessing to those who put their trust in Him. Now what did the law say about worship? Well, you should worship the Lord your God, and He's the only one you should worship. What did the Old Testament teach about trusting? He said it's better to put your trust in the Lord than put confidence in men. So the law taught the idea of worship and adoration and trust did not belong upon man. It only belonged upon God. And here with regards to the Son of God, He said, you better kiss Him or look what He has the authority to do. He has the authority to pour out His wrath on you and make you perish in the way. What did the law say about man having that right? He didn't. The law said man didn't have the right to pour out his wrath on others. The law forbid it. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. The pouring out of wrath is a right or an authority that belongs exclusively to God. And this passage assigns that to the Son, whom we must kiss, so to speak. We must show our allegiance to Him and show that we trust Him in order to avoid divine wrath. So what does that prove to us? It proves to us that God has a Son. And that Son possesses the divine characteristics of being a right subject of worship and trust and having the right to pour out divine wrath as an act of revenge against those who reject Him. There's no escaping the logic that shows us Psalms 2 is teaching that God has a Son, that Messiah is His Son, and He has the right of divine wrath, and to receive divine privilege. The Old Testament refers to God's Son as the mighty God. Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, probably a familiar passage to most of you. A passage that joins with a kind of a 3-chapter section there from chapter 7 through chapter 9 in the book of Isaiah of foretelling the birth of Jesus Christ. And here he brings it to a very specific point. He said, "For unto us a child is born." Listen to the language. "Unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Who is the Prince of Peace but Jesus Christ? Everybody understands that. And a correct reading of this passage recognizes that he is the subject of this passage. Listen, whoever the subject of this passage is, it's someone that was born as a child, that is a son, and that is titled a mighty God. How could that be anybody but Jesus? There's no way within the framework of an Old Testament reading that wants to deny that God has a son, there's no way to read this passage to a happy resolution of that doctrine. There's no question that this passage clearly teaches that God's Son would be born into the world and that he himself would be divine. That is this teaching of the humanity and the deity of Christ. I want to ask you to observe in another passage that's known universally by interpreters to be messianic. Jeremiah 23 and verse 6 talks about the Christ and calls him the Lord. It said, "In his days Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell safely. Now this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness." Now let's take a moment to talk about that name, Lord. There's a casual, or maybe I could say an informal sense in which we encounter the term Lord in the Old Testament. It translates a word that just can mean like a civil authority or an overseer, much like we don't so much use the term this way today, but in relatively recent history it was common for people to refer to someone as a lord, meaning they had a governorship over a particular region, someone that was a nobleman, a lord, okay? And you'll find that word, that idea in the way that word is used in the English translation of the Old Testament. But you'll also find the word Lord in the King James, it's in all caps. Other translations do different things with it. When you see the word Lord in the Old Testament in the King James Version in all caps, that indicates something different than the Hebrew word for an ordinary lord or lordship. It's the divine name. The Hebrews were so superstitious about that divine name, they wouldn't write the whole thing out. They just wrote the consonants. They wouldn't write the vowels. And when you see Lord, that's the consonants of the divine name. Nobody knows exactly how it's pronounced. So in our English language, they've assigned to that the name Jehovah. So a handful of times you'll see Jehovah in the King James Version. That's an attempt to represent the sounding of the divine name, Lord. But most often you'll just see it like this right here. And make no mistake about it, Jehovah is the divine name. And it indicates deity. And this passage, speaking of the Son of God, the Messiah, okay, the branch of David, when you study in its context, that's the Messiah. It says his name would be the Jehovah our righteousness. There's no escaping the idea that he's calling the Christ a divine name, Jehovah. So God's Son, according to the Old Testament, is divine and is God's Son and is a child born. Another messianic passage in Psalms 45 and verse 6, in talking to the Messiah, says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom." No human king could be the subject of words such as these. Your throne is forever and ever. Not just saying, well, it just keeps on going in a sense of casual perpetuity like it'll eventually end, but stated in an emphatic way that says it never stops. It keeps on going and never stops. That has to be divine. And that's exactly what he said. Your throne, O God. And when he said that, he was talking to the Messiah, who is the subject of the 45th Psalm. And so we find the Son of God being referred to as God, a divine being with an eternal throne in the Old Testament.